Mark II, the powerboat which he hopes will succeed where last year its predecessor failed. Mr. Branson is to try once again for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. Last time he got within 140 miles of success. This time, as Carol Walker reports, he hopes to do better.
It's just 8 months since Richard Branson and his crew of 9 set off from New York in Challenger 1 with high hopes of taking the blue riband. They were well on course to break the record set by an American liner more than 30 years ago when disaster struck.
Split. The whole of the bottom of the hull. Split. Split.
The crew were safely rescued, and within hours Richard Branson vowed he'd try again. Challenger 1 sunk without trace into the Atlantic, just 100 miles short of the finishing line. Today in Lowestoft, the brand new boat, built in record time to replace her, was officially launched by Princess Michael of Kent. But Challenger 2 had a somewhat shaky start.
This happened last time.
It was almost ominously similar to last year's launch. Challenger 2 is very different to her predecessor. Instead of a catamaran, she has a single hull. She's stronger and faster, and packed with the latest technology to help navigate the hazardous route across the Atlantic. The designers say they've learnt a lot from what happened last year.
You see, nothing's going to break this boat.
Apparently unconcerned about bad omens, Richard Branson carved the bow off a cake replica of Challenger, but he admits he can't help feeling very nervous.
I went out in the boat. We had a sort of sneak trial yesterday, and to be honest, I felt thoroughly sick. And I rang up Dag Pike, our seasoned navigator, and said, Dag, I hate to admit it, I felt absolutely rotten. And he said, oh, thank God you admitted it. And I felt absolutely rotten too, thinking about last year.
Challenger 2 will undergo rigorous sea trials over the next few weeks. Weather permitting, she'll leave New York in mid-June in pursuit of the transatlantic record.
Carol Walker.
Second attempt to recapture the blue ribbon for Britain. To do that, he'll have to travel the 3,000 miles from the United States and arrive in Britain by 9 o'clock on Sunday night. When he tried in August of last year, his boat sank just 138 miles from home. But it was a confident Branson and crew who left New York in the early hours of the morning for what he hoped would be a record-breaking journey.
Dawn along the East River and the Virgin Challenger on its way to a final stop-off in Manhattan. The consensus on the weather, it's as good as they'll get.
The boat's ready, the crew are ready, and the weather forecast anyway is reasonable. So hopefully Sunday morning we'll be there for Sunday lunch anyway.
They headed out along Manhattan Island in search of the first new transatlantic record for 35 years and the coveted blue riband. The Ambrose Lighthouse marked the official start of the journey. They didn't stop for it. The boat powered out towards Nova Scotia, where it's scheduled to refuel. From there onto the so-called Great Circle route, the quickest course across the Atlantic. Between them and their Sunday lunch in Britain, just under 3,000 miles. This is Tim Sebastian for the 9 o'clock news in New York.
So the Challenger is now approaching Nova Scotia, where she'll be making one of 3 refueling stops. Her destination, the Bishop's Rock Lighthouse off the Isles of Scilly.
At the Atlantic Challenger Operations Room in London, they're monitoring the boat's progress round the clock and working out predicted timings and weather patterns on the highly sophisticated equipment. Communications by radio telephone have proved difficult, but the crew have been able to get through with telex reports. Richard Branson said they'd hit some fairly large pieces of debris, but they'd just bounced off the hull. The atmosphere here is still very tense. No one can quite forget last year's disaster. But the latest news is that Challenger is nearly 2 hours ahead of schedule, due to reach the first refueling stage within the next hour. The main worry at the moment is some heavy fog, forecast for mid-Atlantic tomorrow. A few minutes ago, I spoke to Tomorrow's World's Peter McCann, who's on board Challenger.
The seas were totally calm, and she was able to maintain a maximum speed of some 50 knots. The only point of excitement at that stage, as far as I was concerned, was when I was driving a whale surfaced some 50 meters in front of the boat. I just managed to swerve to avoid it, and it passed some 2 meters on the starboard side. At the moment, with the seas at some 2 meters in height, we've had to slow down to around 40 knots. But we expect to be at the first refueling rendezvous in about 2 hours' time. That's a little bit ahead of schedule. This is Peter McCann for the 9 o'clock news aboard the Virgin Atlantic Challenger.
And finally...
Well, all around me, there's an absolute crush of television, press and radio reporters all trying to get the latest news on Challenger's progress since she left New York yesterday morning. Well, Peter McCann is one of the crew, and on a boat where it's difficult enough to stand upright, he's doing his best to send us his reports. After he finished filming Challenger's first refueling stop last night, he took the opportunity to hand over those precious tapes. Well, we had those pictures rushed home, so we now proudly present the very first pictures on the crossing from inside Virgin Atlantic Challenger 2.
Unfortunately, some of the waves are exactly the length of the boat. It's just dropping right in them.
So what did you say?
The frequency is such that they're the exact length of the boat. It's just going right into something.
Yeah, disappearing straight through the wave instead of straight over the wave.
Well, as we suspected, our period of superb weather was not very long-lived. At the moment, the seas are breaking up, and there is some bad weather that is quite a possibility coming over from mainland America and over the coast. So there's a possibility that that could well slow us up. So any extra miles per hour that we can, at the moment, have in the bag, so to speak, the better.
Again! Neutral! Yeah, okay.
In fact, the choppy seas meant a trip below for engineer Eki Rastic, because when Challenger completely left the water, her engine speed shot up and they automatically cut out.
Well, I'm glad you were busy up front while I was busy at the back. My first time. Feeling very white.
Well, that was only a temporary setback and they were soon underway. Now, the latest news is that they reached the second refuelling point here, where they took on 12 tons of fuel, and they then set off well within the time they'd allocated for the refuelling. However, the engine then cut out. They got it started again, the engine cut out again. We then had a radio message to the effect that they thought that there could be water in the fuel tanks. And we haven't heard any more since then, but there's conjectures here that it could well be an airlock. So with me now is Peter Burkett, who's the ship's co-designer. What do you think the trouble could be?
Well, as you say, we've heard very little from the actual vessel. This has occurred because when they shut the engines down to rectify the fault, they wanted to conserve all the battery power to be able to start the engines again. They're big engines, they require a lot of power to start again. So we have no communication with the boat. The boat's actually alongside the rig and the refueling vessel, and the reports we're having from them is that they are working on the boat. Mm-hmm. Now, the last report we had was about half an hour ago. We don't know if they're up and running yet. Obviously, this delay is going to mean a slight setback in whatever they break the record in, mm-hmm. But they're still online to break it comfortably.
Now the boat has been running very well so far, hasn't she?
Mm-hmm.
You must be pleased with that.
Oh, of course I'm pleased with that. I mean, the seas haven't been particularly smooth, and the boat's taken them very, very well. In fact, it's performed as well as I would have hoped.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. Well, over here we've got yet another Peter. Now, Peter is from the Met Office. Now, this is a delay of a few hours. How's this going to affect them weather-wise?
Oh, not much. In fact, if anything, slightly beneficial. They're about here, and there's a cold front here, a very light one, which is moving away, in fact, so it's producing the conditions.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed for all that. Now, we will be back tomorrow morning on the Saturday Picture Show to bring you up to date with the reports. Obviously, it's very interesting because the boat is not running at the moment. everyone's very optimistic here that she will be underway shortly, and we all hope that she does do a very good job of beating that record. So please join us tomorrow morning on the Saturday Picture Show at 8:30. See you then. Good night. Too well, Mark.
OK. Can you hear me now?
I can, yes. Yes, what did you say?
I said, I bet you're excited, aren't you?
I am, yes. I tell you what, the relief, you know, when we came in this morning and that boat was underway was absolutely incredible.
Can you tell us exactly what happened again?
Well, yes, if you just have a look at our map here, Mark, this is a refuelling point here. Can you see that? That's the second refuelling point.
Yes.
And what happened was that they took on board all the fuel, they began to move away, and the engines cut out, and they got the boat started again, they cut out again. And they discovered that they had got 4 tons of water in the fuel tank. Now, when you think that they only took on 12 tons of fuel, it's a phenomenal amount of water to have had in those tanks. Anyway, this is their position at the moment, so obviously everything is going well. They're heading away at about sort of 47 knots. In fact, 48 knots I think they're up to, which is absolutely excellent. Yes. But I believe we have got Peter McCann on the telephone in here, fingers crossed, right? So we'll just find out how they coped with that situation. So into the radio room here. Hello, Peter?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me, Peter?
Yes, I can hear you.
Lovely.
All right,
now, Peter, can you tell me, how did you cope with getting all that water out of the tanks?
Well, it was a very long job. What we had to do was to drain out the water from the bottom of the tanks. Fortunately, the water does sink to the bottom, so therefore it can be got out by the drainer plug at the bottom of each tank. And we had to pump that overboard. It really was very, very pure water. And then we had to drain down the engines because they had obviously sucked in a lot of water, which was why they died in the first place. But all this took such a long time. We were there stopped at that particular refueling point for about 7¼ hours, which is what set us back so badly. Over.
Goodness. Are you happy that you've got all the water out of those tanks?
Well, no, this is the big problem. As I speak at the moment, we're lying dead and helpless in the middle of the Atlantic because both engines have died. We are getting water trickling along at a slow rate, but eventually it fills up a thing called the separator, which is on the side of the engine. That is specifically designed to separate the water from the fuel. But unfortunately, the water is coming in at such a rate that we keep on having to send our engineers down into the engine room to try and empty that separator so that it can refill itself again. I may say that they're working very, very hard. You can imagine what it's like if you're in a boat pounding along at 47 knots. There's a lot of banging around, and these guys are in a fairly small confined area being thrown around between the heavy steel engines, and they're doing a quite incredible job. Over.
I have to be honest, Peter, I can't imagine in the least what it must be like. It must be terrible. We were obviously very concerned here, but what it's like on the boat, I really don't know. Now, I know that you've got important jobs to get on with, but I believe that Richard Branson is to hand. Would it be possible to have a quick word with him?
Yes, he's right next to me now. I'll hand you over. Hello, Maggie.
Richard, what sort of state are the crew in? Over.
Everybody's holding up very well. Obviously, from the engineer's point of view, it's particularly unpleasant with them. They've actually decided to stay in the engine room for the next few hours and suffer it down there, and it's pretty filthy. Steve Ridgway, he also has to keep on going down there. Obviously, doesn't feel too good as a result, and everyone's fairly tired and exhausted. But if we can get there in time, we'll be quite happy. Over.
Now tell me, Richard. Obviously, you know, Peter was saying you were delayed for 7¼ hours last night. Delays possibly in the future. What do you reckon your chances are of breaking that record?
Well, we were about 6 hours ahead before that delay. We'd had an incredible start. So we're slightly behind now. If we can just keep going, we'll be all right. The problem is that in the fuel tanks, there's foam, and the foam has collected the water, and we couldn't get rid of that water in the foam. That is now coming through into the system, and in fact, it's just stopped the boat. The engineers are down there trying to get it started again. If we can get it started and get it up and running, we still have a good chance of getting home on time. Over.
Well, Richard, everyone here is rooting for you, everyone in the control room, everyone in Britain. You make sure you bring that blue ribbon home. All right? Over.
We promise we'll do our best. Over. We don't want to do it again.
Thank you very much, Richard. Well, that was Richard Branson there on the phone. I've got my fingers crossed. They've got to bring that back, that blue ribboned mark.
OK, thanks. I think Maggie Philbin has said it all, hasn't she, really? We're all keeping our fingers crossed.
That motley crew there, that's the OB team. The man in the shirt is our director. The lady in pink is the official worrier. But if you come inside, you'll see just how bizarre the setup is, because on the one hand, in there is the control room, packed out with all the latest technological equipment to help that team get across the Atlantic. But if you look around, you'll see that we're in the middle of a record shop. And not just any old record shop. This is the largest record store in Europe. There's over 250,000 records in store. Whoops, just helped the cable there. And what's more, they've got a computer, so that if you want to track down some really obscure things, say like the Tomorrow's World theme tune, they can guarantee that if that record exists, they'll find it for you. Now, if you come into this area here, this anteroom has been set aside for the world's press. Last night it was absolutely packed out with newspaper reporters and film crews. Up there you've got the latest telexes. There's a bank of telephones for the use of the press behind me. And behind this door we've been very privileged because we are allowed inside the control room. Now, a quick glance will tell you that there's a lot of activity going on in here at the moment. Obviously they're very concerned about Challenger. No more news at the moment, she still isn't running. But on a more mundane level, something that occurred to me was with the boat going at the kind of speed she does, how on earth do they manage to eat?
Great not to have fog. I mean, that's obviously one of the big worries, and normally this time of year it's absolutely dreadful. So.
You know, when we were tied up alongside the very smart Water Club in downtown Manhattan, an American came up to me and said how splendid the boat looked, and then he asked me about the air conditioning on board, and after that he said to me, and how do you guys cook? I guess you have microwave. And then he paused for a moment and he said, no, you wouldn't know that because you'll be taking your chef along and you'll leave it to her. So when I told him that all we had was sandwiches, he was aghast.
Oh, cheese. What is this? Cheese. All cheese. Oh, no. This one here. Yes, ham. Go for that. Dag? Dag. Cheese?
You're trying to get rid of those cheese.
Well, I know just how they feel about those cheese sandwiches, because cheese, believe it or not, is just about the only thing that I can't eat between two slices of bread. Well, our next report on Challenger's progress will be at 6:10 this evening, so do join us then if you're interested in finding out whether or not that boat is going to beat the record. Mark?
Excellent. What a wonderful report. Thank you very much indeed, Maggie.
Well, if you were watching the news a little earlier on, you'll know that an RAF Nimrod was on its way to Challenger with some desperately needed fuel filters. Well, I've just been in touch with the boat, but I have to break off radio communication because the Nimrod is nearby and obviously they need to liaise urgently. Well, with me here is Peter Downey, the ship's engineer who was unfortunate enough to lose his place because of a broken foot. Now, you broke your foot as a result of the violent banging of the boat, didn't you?
That's right. I got thrown up in the air over a wave, yes.
So that gives us some idea of the sort of effort that the guys have been putting in on the boat. They've been down in the engine room today. In fact, we've got some pictures of the engine coming up now, and we'll be able to see the fuel filters which have caused all the problems. There they are, just at the back there.
Right. It's very difficult to get in there and change the filters because they're outboard of the engines, there'll have been diesel around, so it'd be slippy. You'd have to concentrate and work very hard to do it, so it's certainly not an easy job.
Yeah, and it's been thrown around and everything, I should think.
That's right, and the smell of the diesel, and the engine room's quite warm anyway, so it's a very difficult task to perform.
Now, they've obviously been very successful because the boat has been up and running.
Yes, so far they've managed to contain the water problem. They ran out of filters virtually in the end, but now they have the new ones with them. They should, be able to solve the problem quite well.
It's very, very relieved to see the Nimrod arriving, I should think.
That's right. I think they're the most relieved people there are.
Well, the boat has been maintaining a good speed of 50 knots, and if she maintains that speed, it means that she's going to reach this third refuelling point here at about 10:30 tonight. And this is where navigation really comes into it, because in the words of the navigator Dag Pike, he said it's a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack, because this is an Irish Navy patrol vessel. So the navigator's really got his work cut out. Obviously time is at a premium, and I bet they're feeling very, very relieved that this was the one occasion they decided they really did need to practice. Now they're trying to meet up with an Irish Navy offshore patrol vessel, Aoife, to take on 12 tons of fuel for the last leg.
So then, with the others being carried out more slowly. Over.
Now what happens here is a stern-to-bow transfer, so the Irish Navy vessel maintains a constant distance from Challenger. Now this is obviously important because it means that once the fuel lines are connected, there's no danger of them being torn apart. Well, in this practice session, it took nearly 20 minutes just to get the hoses linked up. And when they do it for real, they won't have the benefit of daylight. It's going to be pitch dark. With me now is Tim Powell, who's our ops room controller. Now, I believe that once they leave that refuelling point, they're going to have to divert course.
Yes, that's right. Through the afternoon, we've all got together here. We've had Sonny Levy, who designed the boat, and Peter Deeks from the Met Office, and Rob Harth, and even a representative, Manfred Bernhardt, from the engine makers. And we've all been looking at the weather and trying to decide the best thing for the last run into the Bishop's Rock for the Challenger. We just heard that her speed, in fact, is now dropped to 35 knots. Right. So she is already in some bad water. So we have taken a decision in the last 20 minutes to reroute her on a more southerly course. It's a very simple course. It's 3 straight lines straight into Bishop's Rock, and it increases her total run by no more than 25 miles. But we believe it'll give her a much easier passage, and hopefully the speed will pick up and we'll be in good shape.
Well, thank you very much for all that, Tim. Obviously, we're going to keep you posted on Challenger's progress throughout the rest of the weekend on BBC One, so I hope you'll keep watching because we're all on absolute tenterhooks here. It's touch and go.
50-50. A combination...
Going on?
Yes, Maggie, we've had 2 lots of problems, really. One has been the engines, which I'm sure most people have heard about, because we had 5 to 10 gallons of water put into the fuel at our second refueling rendezvous. Now, that's been a problem because the water has kept going through to the engines, and we've had engines die on us throughout our trip. The other problem that is with us at this very minute is a navigational one, and that is because at the moment we're in between all sorts of different navigational systems that the computers come up with. The first is one which is particularly useful for America called Loran. Then there's a system called Omega, and there's one called SatNav for the middle of the Atlantic. And there is a final one called Decca, which is all around the British shores. Now, we happen to be in between all of these, and the SatNav is really not very satisfactory.
Peter, I'm going to have to leave this conversation here, otherwise we're going to end up in the next programme. Can I just briefly say that they're about 220 miles off the finishing point. If they carry on at the estimated speed, they should hit the finishing line at about 7 o'clock this evening. We'll be keeping you posted. Sorry to be so rude there, Peter. Certainly looking very promising at the moment. Challenger has covered most of the 3,000 miles, and our present position is here, just 3 hours off the finishing line. Now, I've been in the thick of things the past few days, but I do know, Rob, there's quite a few people who don't see it as a challenge at all. They say you're competing against a 1952 passenger liner.
Well, of course, a passenger liner several hundred feet long doesn't take the sort of pounding that a 70-foot powerboat takes in these conditions, and the liner's engines are much more powerful. And secondly, a liner's crew work in shifts, whereas the crew of Challenger have to work round the clock for 3 solid days in order to keep the boat going on course. It's a terrific challenge for both machinery and for the crew.
So it's not the piece of cake that people seem to think it is?
It's not a piece of cake at all.
Well, as I said, their present position is...
All this should already have been changed and on, and we're now off on our way.
Challenger was back on course for the record. At St Mary's on the Isles of Scilly this afternoon, families of the crew went out to get a taste of the Atlantic for themselves, though they opted for a decidedly sedate vessel. A short time ago, a helicopter delivered the official timekeepers to their positions on top of the Bishop Rock Lighthouse. They're using computerized equipment, synchronized with the Americans nearly 3,000 miles away. The Bishop Rock finishing line is just 7 miles from the tiny harbour here at St Mary's. Every previous holder of the blue ribbon has been far too large to consider coming here. So the islanders are determined to provide a memorable welcome if Virgin Atlantic Challenger can make it this time.
Received this report from the Isles of Scilly.
Challenger powered past the Bishop Rock Lighthouse at almost 50 knots, shattering the record that had stood for 34 years. And there was no hiding the sheer elation of Richard Branson and his crew.
Challenger, the Bishop Rock Lighthouse. Congratulations.
Despite pouring rain and more than 3 arduous days at sea, the exuberance overshadowed any tiredness. And the £1.5 million powerboat showed no signs of the pounding she'd taken from the Atlantic waves. And at St Mary's, it seemed the entire population of the Isles of Scilly was awaiting Challenger's arrival. It's the first time the people of the Isles of Scilly have had the chance to welcome the winner of the blue ribbon. It's pouring with rain, but nothing will mar the celebrations tonight. Richard Branson, the head of the multi-million-pound airline and record empire, had succeeded in his dream of taking the blue ribbon, but he still didn't avoid a ducking in the Atlantic.
40-30.
Richard Branson says he doesn't care. Carol Walker is with the record breakers.
In St Mary's Harbour today, the blue ribbon was draped over what passes for a masthead on a £1.5 million powerboat. It's the traditional prize for the fastest transatlantic crossing. The Americans have said they will not relinquish the Hales Trophy. It's for liners, not toy boats, was their comment. But this morning, Richard Branson received the Isles of Scilly Trophy, made from the original light bulb of the Bishop Rock Lighthouse by a former keeper there.
This is far more meaningful than the Hales Trophy in that it's been built by the man who's been looking after the lighthouse, and that's the lighthouse that we had to get to.
A sample from the fuel filters, looking a bit like the latest cocktail, illustrated the problem which almost cost the record: diesel floating on water. Challenger's engineers had to work round the clock to try to drain 4 tons of water out of the engines. And they were down to the last set of fuel filters when an RAF Nimrod flew out to meet them in mid-Atlantic, delivering supplies of new filters. Despite the delay, she powered over the Bishop Rock finishing line, cutting more than 2 hours off the transatlantic record. Richard Branson left the Isles of Scilly by more conventional means, but he's already thrown down the gauntlet for others to try to take the blue ribbon.
Carol Walker with the Atlantic Challenger. Well, later in the programme, the British